June 4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning, Pacific Ocean, 240 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Aviation Machinist's mate second class Floyd Adkins crouched in the rear cockpit of his SBD Dauntless dive bomber, his hands gripping a 175-pound Browning machine gun that had torn completely free from its mount. The aircraft bucked and twisted as Ensign William Pittman threw the plane into violent evasive maneuvers. 30mm cannon shells from a Zero fighter tore past their wingtips. Below them, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers burned from horizon to horizon, their flight decks erupting in cascades of flame and secondary explosions. Adkins had no time to process what he was seeing. The Zero was closing fast, its pilot pressing the attack with the desperate fury of a man watching his fleet die beneath him. The machine gun weighed as much as a full-grown man. Without its mount, Adkins had to physically manhandle the weapon, using his body weight and raw strength to aim the twin .30 caliber barrels. His shoulders screamed, the gun's recoil hammered against his chest with each burst. He could not maintain steady fire. He could barely hold on. But he kept firing. The Zero broke off its attack run, trailing smoke. Adkins would never know if his bullets had found their mark, or if the Japanese pilot had simply decided the damaged bomber was not worth the ammunition. It did not matter. He and Pittman were still alive, their Dauntless was still flying, and somewhere behind them, the Japanese carrier strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was being consumed by fire. This moment, this desperate struggle with a broken weapon in the back seat of a dive bomber, represented something the United States Navy had not planned for, had barely trained for, and had certainly not expected to need. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The rear gunners of the SBD Dauntless were supposed to be radio operators first, defensive gunners second. They were not fighter pilots. They were not aerial combat specialists. Most had received minimal gunnery training before being thrust into combat. Some, like Oral Moore flying from the carrier Hornet that morning, had never attended gunnery school at all. They learned to shoot by shooting at Japanese airplanes. Yet, on June 4th, 1942, these men in the exposed rear cockpits of America's dive bombers would help decide the outcome of the most important naval battle of the Pacific War, not through superior training, not through advanced weaponry, but through something the Japanese had not anticipated and could not easily counter, the willingness of American aircrews to turn their bombers into fighters when the situation demanded it. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was never designed to dogfight with the Mitsubishi Zero. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, better armed, and flown by pilots who had been fighting since the invasion of China in 1937. By every measure of aerial combat capability, a Zero should have destroyed an SBD in seconds. But the SBDs kept coming back, shot full of holes, engines trailing smoke, hydraulics destroyed, they kept flying. And their gunners, cramped in rear cockpits with inadequate armor protection and weapons that sometimes broke free from their mounts, kept firing back. This is the story of how vulnerability became a kind of weapon, how the exposed position of the SBD rear gunner, which should have been a fatal weakness, instead became a psychological factor the Japanese could not ignore, and how men like Floyd Adkins, wrestling with broken equipment above a burning fleet, discovered that sometimes the most important thing in combat is simply refusing to stop. To understand what happened in the skies above Midway on June 4th, 1942, you must first understand what the Japanese believed about their chances of victory, and more specifically, what they believed about American resolve. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the first 6 months of the war proving a simple thesis, that American forces, when confronted with overwhelming Japanese tactical superiority, would break and retreat. This was not propaganda. This was observable reality, confirmed in battle after battle. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier strike forces had operated with near impunity. They had sunk 5 battleships in a single morning. They had driven the British Eastern Fleet from the Indian Ocean, sinking the carrier Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers without losing a single ship. They had conquered territory from the Dutch East Indies to Wake Island, from Malaya to the Philippines. Everywhere the Kido Butai appeared, Allied forces withdrew or died. The Japanese Zero fighter had become synonymous with air superiority. Its pilots had trained for years. They had combat experience that stretched back to 1937. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, formation tactics at a level American pilots were only beginning to learn. When Zeros engaged enemy aircraft, the outcome was rarely in doubt. American torpedo bomber attacks at Midway that morning had seemed to confirm everything the Japanese believed about American combat effectiveness. 41 devastators attacked the Japanese carriers, 35 were shot down, not one torpedo hit. Japanese fighter pilots described the attacks as target practice. The slow, obsolete devastators lumbered toward their targets at wave-top height, their defensive machine guns firing ineffectively as Zeros slashed through their formations. One pilot survived. The slaughter of Torpedo Squadron 8 was watched from the Japanese carriers with something approaching pity mixed with contempt. These Americans were brave. No one questioned their courage. But bravery, without skill, without proper equipment, without coordination, was simply suicide. The Japanese had been fighting in China for 5 years. They understood that courage alone meant nothing against superior tactics and training. This belief extended to dive bomber crews as well. The Japanese knew American SBDs would attack. They had fought SBD Dauntlesses at Coral Sea 1 month earlier. The dive bombers were capable aircraft, certainly more effective than the obsolete devastators. But they were still bombers. Once they released their ordnance and pulled out of their dives, they became vulnerable. Zeros could catch them. Anti-aircraft fire could hit them. The rear gunners, cramped in their open cockpits with light .30 caliber machine guns, posed minimal threat. The doctrine was clear: eliminate the bombers during their attack runs, or catch them as they withdrew. Either way, American losses would be catastrophic. The mathematics of attrition favored Japan. What the Japanese did not account for was the psychology of the rear gunners themselves. These men occupied what was arguably the most exposed position in carrier aviation. They sat with their backs to the direction of travel during attack runs. They had no control over the aircraft. Their armor protection was minimal. If the pilot was killed or incapacitated, they had limited ability to save themselves. By every rational measure, being an SBD rear gunner was a position you should want to escape from as quickly as possible. But something different was happening in American dive bomber crews. The pilots and gunners were developing an aggressive mindset that contradicted their aircraft's nominal role. SBD crews were not simply dropping bombs and fleeing. They were turning into attacking Zeros. They were engaging in extended gun battles with faster, more maneuverable fighters. When damaged, instead of attempting to escape, they often continued to maneuver offensively. This made no tactical sense. A damaged dive bomber should run for friendly airspace. The rear gunner should conserve ammunition for defensive purposes only. Engaging enemy fighters in extended combat violated every principle of bomber crew survival. Yet it kept happening. At Coral Sea in May, Lieutenant John Lepler and his gunner John Lisker had claimed 7 victories over 2 days of combat. The actual number was certainly lower, but the claims themselves revealed something important. SBD crews believed they could fight Zeros and win. That belief, whether accurate or not, changed how they fought. The Japanese had built their tactical doctrine around the assumption that bomber crews would behave rationally, drop ordnance, escape, preserve the aircraft for future missions. When American crews instead behaved aggressively, treating their dive bombers as multi-role fighter bombers, it created problems the Japanese Combat Air Patrol was not designed to handle. A Zero pilot pursuing a fleeing bomber knew his target would continue straight, perhaps with minor evasive maneuvers. But if the bomber suddenly turned into the attack, forcing a head-on gun pass, the equation changed. The Zero pilot now faced forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, considerably more powerful than the defensive .30 calibers in the rear cockpit. Head-on passes were dangerous for both aircraft. More importantly, bomber crews turning into attacks consumed time and attention from the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. Every Zero engaged with a maneuvering bomber was a Zero not covering the carriers. Every second spent pursuing a single damaged SBD was a second. The fleet remained vulnerable to other attackers. The American dive bomber crews at Midway understood they were flying obsolescent aircraft into the teeth of the most experienced naval air force in the world. They knew the odds. They knew most of them would not return. But they had also internalized a lesson from the early months of war. Aggressive action, even from inferior positions, could disrupt enemy timing and create opportunities. This was not about superior American fighting spirit. The Japanese had fighting spirit in abundance. This was about tactical doctrine meeting unexpected behavior, when the opponent refuses to behave predictably, when defensive crews act offensively, when damaged aircraft continue to fight. The carefully constructed tactical system begins to experience friction it was not designed to absorb. By 10 o'clock on the morning of June 4th, the Japanese believed they had won the tactical battle for Midway. The torpedo bomber attacks had been annihilated. The combat air patrol had performed flawlessly. The carriers were preparing to launch their counterstrike against the American fleet. Victory seemed assured. What they did not know was that 47 SBD Dauntless dive bombers were approaching from high altitude, and that the gunners in those rear cockpits had already decided they would not behave like bomber crews were supposed to behave. The rear cockpit of an SBD Dauntless was not designed for comfort or heroism. It was designed for function, and barely that. The seat could pivot to face forward or backward. When facing aft for defensive gunnery, the gunner sat exposed to the slipstream, cramped against equipment and ammunition boxes, with minimal protection from the elements or enemy fire. The twin 30 caliber Browning machine guns were mounted on a flexible ring. In theory, this allowed the gunner 360 degrees of traverse. In practice, the ring mount had limitations. The guns could jam, the mount could break under stress, the ammunition belts could twist or foul, and unlike the forward-firing 50s in the pilot's cowling, the rear 30s were hand-operated. No synchronization, no powered traverse, just muscle and timing. Aviation Radioman 3rd Class. Lloyd Childers, flying from Yorktown on June 4th, had turned 21 years old that morning. Before dawn, he had eaten steak and eggs in the mess deck, food the crew quietly acknowledged as a last meal for condemned men. Hours later, strapped into the rear cockpit of a Devastator torpedo bomber, he would watch from 2,500 feet as his squadron was systematically destroyed by Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Childers survived the attack run. His pilot, Ensign Osborne Call, managed to escape the immediate combat area, but their aircraft was badly damaged. They could not land on Yorktown. Instead, they ditched next to a destroyer. Childers had been wounded multiple times. His machine guns had jammed during the attack. In desperation, he had drawn his .45 caliber pistol and fired at the Zeros, strafing his aircraft. The pistol, of course, was useless against fighters traveling at 300 miles per hour, but Childers fired anyway. He would later say he did not remember making the decision to use his pistol. It was simply the only weapon he had left, and the Zeros were still attacking, so he kept firing. This was not courage in any conventional sense. This was the response of a man who had moved beyond rational calculation into pure reflex. Childers survived his wounds. He recovered, attended flight training at Pensacola, earned his commission in the Marine Corps, and served for 25 more years. But his actions on June 4, 1942, exemplified something important about the rear gunners at Midway. They did not stop fighting when the situation became hopeless. They stopped fighting when they physically could no longer continue. The Japanese pilots attacking the American formations that morning expected bomber gunners to surrender or bail out when their position became untenable. In previous engagements, this had been normal behavior. Aircraft crews, when faced with certain destruction, would attempt to save themselves. Parachutes would blossom. Pilots would ditch near friendly forces. This was rational survival behavior. But at Midway, American gunners kept firing from aircraft that were clearly doomed. They fired from planes trailing flames. They fired from bombers with engines shot out. They fired until their guns jammed, and then, in at least one documented case, they pulled out pistols and kept firing. This behavior was tactically meaningless. A .45 caliber pistol could not damage a Zero fighter, but psychologically, it communicated something the Japanese found unsettling. These crews would not stop. Aviation radioman second-class Oral Moore, flying from Hornet in the morning strike, had never attended gunnery school. His pilot, Ensign William Carter, had urged him to learn as much as possible about flying the aircraft, reasoning that if Carter was killed, Moore might be able to bring the plane home. Moore had practiced engaging the auxiliary control stick, flying straight and level, executing turns. He could not land the aircraft, lacking access to flaps or landing gear, but he might survive a water landing. This was practical preparation for a very real possibility. But it also revealed the mindset developing among SBD crews. Plan for the worst. Prepare to continue the mission regardless of casualties. Assume you will need to improvise with damaged equipment and incomplete information. Moore's squadron from Hornet failed to locate the Japanese fleet that morning. They searched empty ocean until fuel concerns forced them to divert to Midway Island. Moore and his pilot were not part of the devastating attack that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes. They landed on Midway, refueled, and returned to Hornet without engaging the enemy. But Moore's experience was typical of many rear gunners at Midway. Long hours of tension and uncertainty, punctuated by brief moments of extreme violence or the frustration of missing the critical action entirely. The psychological strain of carrier aviation was not just about combat. It was about the constant awareness that death could come at any moment, from any direction, for reasons entirely beyond your control. The SBD rear gunners knew their armor protection was inadequate. They knew a single burst from a Zero's 20mm cannon could kill them instantly. They knew that if their pilot was killed, their chances of survival dropped precipitously. They knew all of this, and they climbed into their exposed rear cockpits anyway, mission after mission, because the war required them to do so. This was not the glamorous heroism of fighter pilots or the technical expertise of bomber commanders. This was the quiet determination of men who understood their job was dangerous and necessary, and who showed up to do it regardless of the odds. When historians later analyzed the Battle of Midway, they focused on the decisive dive bomber attacks, on the intelligence breakthrough that allowed American forces to ambush the Japanese fleet, on the leadership decisions that positioned carriers correctly. But beneath those strategic factors was a more fundamental reality. American air crews, including the rear gunners in their exposed positions, had developed a tactical aggressiveness that Japanese doctrine was not prepared to handle. They did not fight like men who expected to lose. They fought like men who had already internalized the lesson that aggressive action, even from inferior positions, could create opportunities. When Floyd Adkins found himself wrestling a 175-pound machine gun that had torn free from its mount, while Zeros attacked his damaged bomber above a burning Japanese fleet, he was not executing some brilliant tactical plan. He was simply doing what SBD rear gunners at Midway had been trained, informally and through bitter experience, to do. Keep fighting until the situation was resolved, one way or another. The Zero pilot attacking Adkins and Pittman's aircraft probably expected the crippled bomber to go down easily. A machine gun without a mount was effectively useless. The gunner could not aim properly. The recoil would throw off any attempt at sustained fire. This should have been a simple kill. But Adkins kept firing, and the Zero broke off, and the SBD kept flying. This small, tactically insignificant moment was repeated dozens of times in the skies above Midway on June 4, 1942. Rear gunners fighting from damaged positions, pilots maneuvering defensively instead of fleeing, bomber crews refusing to behave like bomber crews. The Japanese had built their tactical doctrine around predictable enemy behavior. When that behavior changed, when the Americans began fighting aggressively instead of defensively, the carefully constructed system began to experience friction it could not easily resolve. And in war, friction accumulates. Small disruptions cascade into larger problems. And sometimes, a gunner wrestling with a broken weapon in the back of a dive bomber contributes more to victory than anyone could have predicted. The men who climbed into the rear cockpits of SBD Dauntless dive bombers at Midway were not professional aerial gunners. They were aviation radiomen, a rating that prioritized communication skills over combat training. Their primary designation was ARM, Aviation Radioman, with numerical grades indicating their experience level. ARM 3C meant Aviation Radioman 3rd class. ARM 2C meant 2nd class. These ratings reflected radio proficiency, not gunnery expertise. John Lisker, who had been credited with 3 victories at Coral Sea 1 month earlier, was ARM 3C. Lloyd Childers, who would fire his pistol at Zeros after his guns jammed, was ARM 2C. Oral Moore, flying from Hornet, was ARM 2C. These men had received basic instruction on the Browning M1900 and 1930 caliber machine gun, but nothing approaching the comprehensive gunnery training given to dedicated fighter pilots or bomber gunners in other theaters. The standard training cycle for an aviation radioman in early 1942 consisted of approximately 8 weeks at radio school, learning Morse code, radio procedure, and basic electrical systems. Gunnery training, when it occurred at all, might consist of a few sessions firing at towed sleeve targets. Some rear gunners reported receiving no formal gunnery instruction before their first combat mission. They learned to shoot by shooting at enemy aircraft. The weapon itself was reliable but limited. The Browning M1919A 430 caliber machine gun had an effective range of approximately 1,000 yards, though practical combat range was considerably less. The weapon fired a .30-06 Springfield cartridge at a rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Each gun belt typically contained 600 rounds, giving the gunner roughly 1 minute of sustained fire before reloading became necessary. The Japanese Zero, by contrast, mounted 2 7.7mm machine guns in the nose and 2 20mm cannon in the wings. The cannon shells were devastating. A single hit from a 20mm round could destroy an aircraft control surface, rupture fuel lines, or kill a crew member instantly. The 7.7mm rounds, while smaller, were still effective against the relatively unarmoured SBD. The rear gunner's position offered minimal protection. Early SBD models had no armour plating behind the gunner's seat. Later variants added thin armour, but it provided protection only against small-caliber fire from directly astern. Attacks from above, below, or the sides left the gunner completely exposed. The canopy was open during combat operations, providing no protection whatsoever from the slipstream or incoming fire. Walter Chokolausek, flying as rear gunner for Commander Wade McCluskey during the decisive morning attack, sat in this exposed position as his pilot led 32 dive bombers toward the Japanese fleet. McCluskey's aircraft had already been searching for 2 hours. Fuel was critically low. When they finally located Japanese carriers at 10:24, Chokolausek knew they had found the target everyone had been hunting. He also knew they would face approximately 30 Zeros in the combat air patrol. The doctrine for rear gunners was straightforward. Conserve ammunition during the attack dive, engage enemy fighters during egress, protect the pilot, and survive long enough to radio position reports if necessary. The reality of combat rendered most of this doctrine moot. Once the dive commenced, everything became improvisation and reaction. The dive itself was violent. SBD pilots typically initiated their attack runs at 14,000 feet, rolling into a 70-degree dive angle. The perforated dive brakes would deploy, stabilizing the aircraft and preventing excessive speed buildup. Inside the rear cockpit, the gunner experienced crushing G-forces as the pilot pulled out of the dive at 2,000 to 2,500 feet. The blood would drain from the gunner's head, vision would narrow, physical coordination became difficult. Then came the most dangerous phase, egress. The SBD, having released its bomb and pulled out of the dive, was now a relatively slow aircraft trying to escape an area saturated with enemy fighters. This was when rear gunners earned their keep. Zeros would dive from altitude, making high-speed passes at the withdrawing bombers. The gunner's job was to disrupt these attacks, force the enemy pilots to break off early, and buy enough time for the SBD to reach friendly airspace or join up with other aircraft for mutual defense. Floyd Adkins, in the rear seat of Ensign Pittman's aircraft, experienced this sequence after their attack on the carrier Kaga. They had scored a near miss. As they withdrew, Zeros pursued. Then Adkins felt the machine gun mount break. The massive twin gun assembly, weighing 175 pounds fully loaded, was no longer secured to the aircraft structure. The mount had failed under stress, possibly from combat damage, possibly from metal fatigue, possibly from both. A rear gunner whose weapon system had failed was, by any rational measure, combat ineffective. The correct procedure would be to inform the pilot, who would then evade as best he could while attempting to reach friendly forces. Engaging enemy fighters with a weapon that could not be properly aimed was pointless, but Adkins did not follow procedure. He grabbed the loose gun assembly, braced it against his body, and continued firing. The recoil was enormous. Without the mount to absorb the shock, every burst hammered directly into his chest and shoulders. He could not maintain a steady aim. The gun would swing wildly after each burst, but he kept firing, using his body weight to wrestle the weapon back into approximate alignment, then firing again. The Zero attacking their aircraft made several passes. Each time, Adkins would manhandle the gun toward the threat and fire. The accuracy was terrible. He was not hitting the Zero, but the act of firing, the visible tracers arcing toward the enemy fighter, was enough to make the Japanese pilot cautious. Instead of pressing in to close range where his cannon would be most effective, the Zero pilot maintained distance. He made his passes more quickly, breaking off earlier than optimal. This was the paradox of the rear gunner's position. The .30 caliber Browning was not powerful enough to reliably shoot down a Zero in a single burst, but the psychological impact of visible defensive fire was significant. Japanese fighter pilots, no matter how experienced, were not eager to fly through a stream of tracer rounds. Even inaccurate fire forced them to maneuver, to break off attacks prematurely, to choose different approach angles. Adkins and Pittman's aircraft survived. They made it back to Enterprise. The SBD was pushed to the side of the flight deck, too damaged for further operations that day. But Adkins had accomplished something that the training manuals never discussed. He had turned a broken weapon system into an effective psychological deterrent through sheer physical determination. This was not an isolated incident. Across the 3 American carriers at Midway, rear gunners were improvising solutions to problems that had no doctrinal answers. Guns jammed, and gunners cleared them under fire. Ammunition ran low, and gunners rationed their remaining rounds. Aircraft were damaged, and gunners continued to operate despite wounds, equipment failures, and the knowledge that their chances of survival were diminishing with each passing minute. The Japanese had anticipated determined American resistance. What they had not anticipated was the level of tactical improvisation and aggressive behavior from crews who, by doctrine and training, should have been primarily focused on survival and withdrawal. The rear gunners at Midway were not supposed to win dogfights. They were supposed to provide covering fire while escaping, but repeatedly they chose to engage rather than evade, to fight rather than flee, and in doing so they created friction in the Japanese tactical system that doctrine had not prepared for. 10:24 a.m. Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his SBD into a 70-degree dive. Below him, the Japanese carrier Kaga steamed in diamond formation with 3 other carriers. Their flight decks were packed with armed aircraft. Fuel lines snaked across wooden planking. Ordnance carts stood beside waiting bombers. Every plane was being prepared for launch against the American carriers. In the rear cockpit, Walter Chochalowsk pivoted his seat to face aft and manned his guns. He knew what was coming. The moment the SBDs began their dives, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol would react. Zeros would climb to intercept. The anti-aircraft batteries on every ship would open fire. The sky would fill with tracers and exploding shells. And when the SBDs pulled out of their dives, they would be at low altitude, slow, and vulnerable. The dive lasted approximately 45 seconds. Chochalowsk felt the G-forces crushing him into his seat as McCluskey pulled out at 2,000 feet. The bomb was away. Then came the turn towards safety, and immediately 2 Zeros were on them. The Japanese fighters dove from above, their 20mm cannon firing. Shells tore through the SBD's airframe. McCluskey felt a round strike his shoulder. The aircraft shuddered under multiple impacts. Chochalowsk opened fire. The twin .30 calibers hammered out tracers toward the nearest Zero. His field of view was limited to what he could see over the SBD's tail. The Zero filled his gun sight. He kept firing, short controlled bursts, leading the target, compensating for the SBD's evasive maneuvers. The Zero's approach changed. Instead of pressing the attack, the Japanese pilot broke off, climbing away. Choshalausik had scored hits. Whether they were lethal, he could not tell, but the Zero was gone. A second Zero attacked from a different angle. Choshalausik swung his guns to engage. More bursts, more tracers reaching out toward the enemy fighter. This Zero also broke off, discouraged or damaged. McCluskey's SBD, now riddled with bullet holes, its fuel gauge reading near empty, continued toward the American fleet. Choshalausik had done his job. The rear gunner's primary mission was not to shoot down enemy fighters. It was to make attacking their aircraft dangerous enough that enemy pilots would break off prematurely. Success was measured in survival, not kills. Across the formation, other rear gunners were fighting similar battles. In Scouting 6, Earl Howell had already shot down 1 Zero. Now, as his pilot, Lieutenant Charles Ware led 6 damaged SBDs in a defensive formation, Zeros continued to harass them. Howell kept firing. The other gunners in the formation kept firing. The Zeros, facing sustained defensive fire from multiple aircraft, could not press their attacks effectively. This was the moment when Japanese tactical doctrine collided with an unexpected reality. The Zero pilots had been trained to exploit the weakness of bomber formations, separate the bombers, attack isolated aircraft, destroy them individually. This had worked against the torpedo bombers earlier that morning. 41 Devastators had attacked, 35 were shot down. The tactics were proven, but the SBD formations were not behaving like the torpedo bombers. When attacked, instead of scattering or attempting to flee individually, the Dauntlesses formed up for mutual defense. The rear gunners provided interlocking fields of fire. Zeros attempting to attack one aircraft would find themselves under fire from gunners in other aircraft. The defensive fire was not particularly accurate, but it was persistent, and it forced the Zero pilots to maneuver more, to break off attacks sooner, to expend more time and ammunition for each attempted kill. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's dive bombers away from the burning carrier Soryu, watched his formation come under sustained Zero attacks. His own aircraft was damaged. His gunner was firing constantly, managing the ammunition carefully to avoid running dry. Leslie counted the aircraft in his formation. 3 were missing, shot down during egress, but 12 were still flying, still fighting. The gunners were still at their posts. One of those gunners was facing a situation no training manual had addressed. His pilot was wounded. The aircraft was trailing smoke. A Zero was closing from dead astern, the optimal attack angle. The gunner opened fire at maximum effective range, roughly 800 yards. The tracers arced across the empty air between the 2 aircraft. At that distance, hitting a maneuvering target was nearly impossible. But the gunner was not trying to hit. He was trying to force a reaction. The Zero pilot saw the tracers. He adjusted his approach, coming in at a steeper angle to avoid the defensive fire. This changed his attack geometry, forcing him to fire from a less optimal position. His burst missed. He broke off to set up another pass, but by then, Leslie's formation had gained distance. The Zero pilot faced a choice: pursue the damaged bomber and risk running low on fuel, or return to defend the fleet. He chose to return. The bomber and its crew survived. This small tactical victory was repeated dozens of times that morning. Rear gunners fighting from damaged positions, pilots maneuvering defensively while wounded, aircraft that should have been shot down limping back to their carriers. The Japanese Zero pilots were not performing poorly. They were executing their doctrine correctly. But the doctrine assumed enemy bombers would behave in predictable ways once they became defensive. The SBD crews at Midway were not behaving predictably. They were fighting back with an aggressiveness that contradicted their tactical situation. Damaged bombers did not flee. They maneuvered offensively. Isolated aircraft did not attempt to hide or surrender. They turned into attacks. Rear gunners with jammed weapons cleared the jam under fire and resumed shooting. Gunners who ran out of ammunition in one gun continued firing with the other. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from surgery on the carrier Akagi when the American dive bombers attacked, would later write about the Battle of Midway with both professional respect and bitter hindsight. He acknowledged that the American attacks had been poorly coordinated. The different squadrons arrived separately. Fighter cover was absent or ineffective. The torpedo bombers were slaughtered. By every measure of tactical execution, the American attacks should have failed. But Fuchida also noted something that Japanese tactical doctrine had not accounted for. The Americans kept coming. Each wave of attackers pressed home their runs despite devastating losses. The torpedo bomber crews, knowing they were flying obsolete aircraft into certain death, attacked anyway. The dive bomber crews, seeing their comrades shot down, continued their attacks. The aggressive mindset of American air crews, their willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of the mission, created a psychological pressure the Japanese had not experienced before. The rear gunners embodied this mindset at its most fundamental level. They occupied the most exposed, most vulnerable position in carrier aviation. They had minimal protection, inadequate weapons, and limited training. By any rational calculation, they should have been the weak point in American dive bomber operations. Instead, they became a source of unexpected resilience. They kept fighting when fighting seemed pointless. They improvised when equipment failed. They turned vulnerability into a form of aggressive defense. At 10:29 a.m., 5 minutes after the first bombs struck the Japanese carriers, 3 of the 4 carriers in the Kido Butai were fatally damaged. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning. Their flight decks were shattered. Their aviation fuel was exploding. Their ordnance was cooking off. The most powerful carrier strike force in the world was dying. The SBD Dauntlesses that had delivered this blow were now fighting their way back to the American fleet. Many would not make it. 18 of the 47 dive bombers that struck the Japanese carriers that morning never returned to their ships. Some were shot down by Zeros. Some crashed into the sea when they ran out of fuel. But the survivors kept flying, and their rear gunners kept fighting, and the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, despite its numerical superiority and superior aircraft, could not prevent most of the American bombers from escaping. This was the collision of doctrine with reality. The Japanese had built their tactical system around the assumption that superior training, superior aircraft, and superior fighting spirit would overwhelm American resistance. Those assumptions had been proven correct in battle after battle for 6 months, but at Midway, something changed. The Americans did not fight better, they fought differently, and that difference, multiplied across dozens of individual engagements, accumulated into a friction the Japanese tactical system could not absorb. The SBD Dauntless crews landing back on Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet throughout the afternoon of June 4th presented visible evidence of what rear gunners at Midway had accomplished. The aircraft were riddled with bullet holes. Some had entire sections of tail structure shot away. Hydraulic fluid leaked from ruptured lines. Fuel tanks showed patches where self-sealing material had prevented catastrophic leaks. The aircraft should not have been flying, but they were. Maintenance crews counted the damage. Enterprise aircraft averaged more than 40 bullet holes per returning bomber. Some had over 100. McCluskey's SBD, flown back by a wounded pilot with a wounded shoulder and barely enough fuel to reach the carrier, had 52 holes. The tail surfaces were nearly destroyed. Flight controls were damaged, yet the aircraft had flown for 3 hours, fought off multiple Zero attacks, and landed successfully. This material evidence contradicted what Japanese tactical doctrine predicted. Bombers sustaining that level of damage should have gone down. The crews should have been killed or forced to bail out. The rear gunners, sitting in the most exposed position, should have been the first casualties. Instead, most of the rear gunners not only survived but continued to operate their weapons throughout the engagement. June 4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning. Floyd Adkins gripping a 175-pound machine gun that had torn free from its mount. The image, captures something essential about warfare that doctrine and strategy often obscure, that battles are decided not just by plans and equipment, but by individual human responses to impossible situations. The rear gunners of the SBD Dauntless at Midway were not supposed to be the decisive factor in the battle. They were radio operators who happened to have guns. They sat in exposed positions with inadequate weapons and minimal training. By every measure of combat effectiveness, they should have been liabilities, weaknesses to be exploited by the superior Japanese fighter force. Instead, they became sources of unexpected resilience, not through superior skill or better equipment, but through a simple refusal to stop fighting when fighting seemed pointless. This transformed vulnerability into a form of strength. The exposed rear cockpit, which should have been a fatal weakness, became a position from which aggressive defense could disrupt enemy tactics and create survival opportunities. The historical irony is profound. The Japanese had spent years developing the most capable carrier aviation force in the world. Their pilots were veterans, their tactics were proven, their equipment was superior. They should have destroyed the American dive bombers with acceptable losses. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to behave according to expectations, that turned defensive positions into offensive platforms, that kept fighting from damaged aircraft that should have crashed. This was not about American moral superiority. The Japanese pilots were as brave, as skilled, as dedicated as any warriors in history. This was about tactical systems encountering behavior they were not designed to handle. When doctrine assumes enemy forces will behave rationally, will retreat when overwhelmed, will surrender when defeat is certain, and instead those forces continue fighting aggressively, the doctrine begins to experience friction. Walter Chochalusek, Lloyd, Childers, Floyd Adkins, Oral Moore, and hundreds of other rear gunners whose names never entered the historical record in detail, each contributed small acts of determination that accumulated into strategic outcomes. No single gunner changed the course of the battle, but collectively, their willingness to fight from exposed positions with inadequate weapons created a tactical environment the Japanese had not prepared for. The Battle of Midway is remembered for the 5 minutes that destroyed Japanese naval supremacy. 3 carriers fatally damaged between 10:24 and 10:29 in the morning. The dive bomber attacks were the decisive action, but those attacks succeeded in part because the bombers could fight their way back to the fleet, and the bombers fought their way back because their rear gunners refused to accept that their defensive position was hopeless. In the decades after the war, historians analyzed Midway endlessly. Intelligence advantage, strategic positioning, luck in timing, all true, all important. But beneath the strategic factors was a more fundamental reality. American aircrews at Midway fought with an aggressive determination that exceeded what their equipment and training should have enabled. This created tactical friction the Japanese could not resolve in the time available. The rear gunners embodied this dynamic perfectly. They occupied positions that were demonstrably inferior to Japanese fighters. They had weapons that were demonstrably inadequate. They had training that was demonstrably insufficient, yet they fought effectively enough to disrupt enemy tactics and contribute to survival rates that made continued American offensive operations possible. The lesson is not that courage overcomes material disadvantages. Midway also demonstrated that courage without adequate support is simply sacrifice. The torpedo bomber crews proved this with their blood. But within the boundaries of minimally adequate equipment and some tactical flexibility, human determination can create outcomes that pure calculation would not predict. Floyd Adkins survived the war. He returned to civilian life. He did not speak extensively about wrestling a broken machine gun above the burning Japanese fleet. Like most veterans, he considered his actions unremarkable. He had done what the situation required, that it might have changed the outcome of his aircraft's survival, which might have contributed marginally to the overall American success, which might have influenced the course of the Pacific War. It was not something he spent time contemplating, but historians contemplate these connections because they matter. Wars are not decided by single heroic acts, they are decided by the accumulation of thousands of small decisions, made under stress by individuals who often do not realize the significance of their choices. When those decisions collectively favor aggression over passivity, improvisation over rigid doctrine, continued action over surrender to circumstances, they create military outcomes that transcend the mathematical predictions of combat power ratios. The exposed position of the SBD rear gunner at Midway should have been a tactical weakness. Japanese doctrine treated it as such. 0 pilots expected to exploit it. The equation was clear. Superior fighter attacks, inferior bomber position, bomber is destroyed. But the equation did not account for the human factor. It did not account for gunners who kept fighting when fighting seemed futile. It did not account for pilots who maneuvered aggressively when passive defense would have been more logical. It did not account for the psychological impact of an enemy that refused to behave predictably. This is why the story matters, not because rear gunners single-handedly won the Battle of Midway. They did not. But because they represent a truth about warfare that is easy to forget when analyzing campaigns and strategies, that battles are ultimately decided by human beings making choices in impossible situations, and that sometimes those choices defy the predictions of doctrine and create outcomes nobody planned. June 4, 1942, 10:22 in the morning. The 5 minutes that destroyed Japan's chance of winning the Pacific War began with a decision by Lieutenant Commander McCluskey to push his dive into a 70-degree angle. But those 5 minutes became decisive in part because 32 rear gunners, sitting in exposed cockpits with inadequate weapons, had already decided they would fight all the way back to the fleet regardless of damage, casualties, or odds. That decision, multiplied across dozens of individual engagements, repeated in battle after battle throughout the Pacific War, was how inferior equipment and incomplete training were compensated for, not through heroic charges or dramatic sacrifices, but through the quiet determination of men who kept working, broken weapons, kept firing from damaged positions, kept fighting when doctrine said fighting was pointless. The exposed position became a weapon. The inadequate gun became effective. The minimal training became sufficient. Not because equipment improved or doctrine changed, but because the men in those rear cockpits refused to accept that their circumstances defined their capabilities. That refusal, more than any single technical or tactical factor, was how the Pacific War was won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.